Hey, Cypher here with another book review. This time, it's this book, The Cheese and the Worms by Carlo Ginzburg. This was the first significant entry in what is now called microhistory. It's an entire subfield of history. What is microhistory? Well, that's a bit complicated, actually. Now we can talk about macrohistory, or the analysis school, which I've talked about Fernand Braudel before on this channel, and that is kind of the direct opposite of microhistory. Microhistory is looking at things at the smallest possible scale. Now, microhistory is different from things like local history and case studies, which I hope you guys will kind of understand by the end of this. But really, to understand what microhistory is, it's best to learn by example. And this is a pretty good example, and I absolutely adore this book and many works of microhistory. It's so well written that you can easily get lost in it, plus it's forgivingly short. By the way, I'm adapting this from a previous review that I already did for a class, so forgive me if there's not a lot of good visuals. Ginzberg explores a 16th century Italian miller's heretical beliefs. That's it. That's all it is. But it goes fascinatingly in depth. The miller, by the name of Domenico Scandella, or simply Menocchio, possessed a surprisingly silly theology. His Genesis mythology consisted of the titular heresy, where he said, all was chaos. That is, earth, air, water, and fire were mixed together, and out of that bulk a mass formed, just as cheese is made of milk, and worms appeared in it, and these were angels. It sounds pretty silly, and it seems even the Roman Inquisition thought so too.
Nobody expects the
Roman
Inquisition.
Many further elaborations reveal the extent of the blasphemy that this man believed. After a couple decades of inquisitorial prosecution, and Menocchio's refusal to renounce his theology, he was burnt at the stake as a heresiarch, as in someone who originates a heresy, by the direct order of Pope Clement VIII. We see along the way various possible influences on his heresy, ranging from local oral tradition, the Reformation, and even the Quran. It is especially telling how much literature he had access to, given what was confiscated by the Roman Inquisition. Ginzberg tells a wonderfully entertaining story. The pages turn faster than I'd reasonably expect of any history book. That appears to be the intent, given that he says the book is intended to be a story as well as a piece of historical writing. Each chapter is composed of compact chunks that are contentedly consumable. Though much of the book consists of block quotes, they are not abrasive, given the whimsical atmosphere they are presented in. Ginzberg makes many subtle jokes that poke fun at the farcical situation. When he explores the creation myth's implications, he says, a quick analogy between the coagulation of cheese and the thickening of a nebula destined to form the terrestrial globe may seem obvious to us, but it certainly wasn't for Menocchio. Ha! Even Menocchio showed humor throughout the inquisitorial proceedings, despite his life having been in the balance. Ginzberg describes one such interaction by saying with mirth, how stubborn this peasant was. The story is amiable, and never loses its charm. This focus on narrative is somewhat troubling, though. The argument Ginzberg is making is difficult to ascertain. The closest to a thesis statement given is, a case such as Menocchio's was made possible by two great historical events, the invention of printing and the Reformation. These two themes certainly play a major role in the story, and Ginzberg's exploration of Menocchio's ideological influences is brilliant. But it is only a part of the story, and not the driving influence. Even with the study of his influences, Ginzberg misses some important possibilities. In a passage revolving around how Menocchio viewed the Holy Trinity, Ginzberg compares Michael Servetus's anti-Trinitarianism. The Unitarian movement was fostered by Servetus, and it continued to build after his execution, with people such as John Asherton, Martin Salarius, Ludwig Hatzer, and Giorgio Biandrata. A more thorough contextualization of Anabaptism as a whole could have been beneficial here, given the immigration and persecution of groups like the Mennonites or grotesque events like the Munster Rebellion. These would have been fascinating connections. But given the more narrative bent of the book, there is no room for such explorations. The inability to expand and contextualize appears to be a flaw with much of microhistory, including Ginzberg's work. Contextualizing to such broader history is somewhat of a distraction from the plot. As he says, a microhistory is supposed to resist succumbing to a foolish fascination for the exotic and incomprehensible. I could argue that he doesn't achieve this goal. Ginzberg chose his subject because Menocchio was a man somewhat different from the other people persecuted by the Inquisition. Yet Ginzberg asked the perfectly appropriate question, what relevance the ideas and beliefs of a single individual of Menocchio's social level can have. Ginzberg goes far to establish Menocchio within 16th century Italy, but what this reveals is clearly debatable. Further context ought to be the goal here, and he is limited by another factor. The sources used to research the cheese and the worms are narrow. It is solely based on the inquisitorial record created surrounding Menocchio. While Ginzberg expands to other sources when contextualizing, roughly 3/4 of the notes reference Inquisition records. This presents two problems. Firstly, the reliance on these records brings into question the veracity of the story itself. While the almost friendly and notably bemused demeanor of the inquisitors is exposed in the copious quotations of their records, that does not exclude the possibility of misunderstanding, poor stenography, and outright fabrication. While Ginzberg toys with the possibility of these things by saying, the fact that a source is not objective does not mean it is useless. Unfortunately, there is not much critique of primary sources. He simply brushes off such criticism by saying there are discrepancies unattributable to either suggestive questioning or to torture. How Ginzberg determines such discrepancies is unclear. This renders much of the narrative questionable, possibly even fictional. While it would detract from the storytelling, a historian ought to plumb such depths, especially given the short length of the book and the unnecessary block quotations without summary. Secondly, the sourcing limits Ginzberg's willingness to expand the contextualization, fitting Menocchio's beliefs into a larger context than simply his possible immediate influences would have helped to make this a more useful history. By focusing solely on the Inquisition documents and using the immediate context as a limiting factor of analysis, Ginzberg brings the entire enterprise of microhistory into question. How can one understand such insignificant figures without the greater context they are situated in? Such concerns are left to the reader to ponder and possibly research themselves. But to those unfamiliar with this historical period, they may be lost altogether by the end of the story. Rather than understanding how, as Ginzberg says, Menocchio falls within a fine, tortuous, but clearly distinguishable line of development that can be followed directly to the present, we don't exactly get that. How does it follow to the present? That's not explained. Despite such interesting problems, the book is more enjoyable than troubling. It's well worth reading and stimulates many possible ways of studying history in the future. If only to show how history may continue to sell well, this is a good example, for it's definitely a good book to read regardless of its interpretive power. Perhaps microhistory is doomed to stay at the scale it renders, but Ginzberg is clearly happy with the aspirations he believes in, no matter how blasphemous to the history profession that may be. So, this sounds pretty interesting, right? Well, I've put an Amazon affiliate link in the description so that you can go and get them. It's been around for quite a while, so should be pretty cheap. So now I've done 2 of these book reviews, and I want to say I'm not exactly taking suggestions or anything like that. I want to emphasize books that I adore, but also put them under some sort of scrutiny, because you shouldn't just take everyone's word for it. You gotta think critically about even historians and the history they tell. Always think critically, but never let that stop you from finding what makes history great. And never loses its... Ah, yeah.